Sorry about that. Okay, so if you could try to keep your microphones muted. Right, okay, so yep, so today we're going to be welcoming members of the UKCoR, which is the UK Committee on RDA, and they're going to be presenting on various developments in RDA. The presentations are going to be recorded and put onto our YouTube channel in due course. As they've already said, you can use the chat to talk to each other or the Q&A to send us questions anonymously. And at the end, if you do wish to ask a question, not via the Q&A, you can raise your hand and we will. You can then unmute your mic when we're invited. Our speakers today are going to be Jenny Wright. She works for BDS and is the chair of the UK Committee on RDA. Jenny is also a member of the IFLA Cataloguing Section Standing Committee, MDG Committee, URIG, and the BIC Library Metadata Group. Thurstan Young is a collection metadata analyst working at the British Library. His role includes implementation of the official RDA Toolkit and MARC 21 developments. Thurstan coordinates the development of British Library policy statements and MARC 21 bibliographic format mappings within the official RDA Toolkit. He currently serves as the UK representative to the MARC Advisory Committee, as well as a member of the European RDA Interest Group's editorial committee. Gordon Dunsire is a retired independent consultant who lives in Edinburgh. He is a former chair of the RDA Steering Committee, a former chair of the RSC Technical Working Group. He liaises between RDA and the IFLA standards with which he is associated, and he is currently working on an ISBD implementation of the library reference model's entity manifestation. And Alan Danskin is the collection metadata standards manager at the British Library and has been involved in RDA in various capacities since 2006 and is a former chair of SILIP-SIG. And with that, I'll hand over to UKCoR.
Thanks, Will, that's great. Thank you very much to the MDG Committee and yourself for this series of webinars. The UKCoR is grateful to have this forum. Our aim today is to bring people who are familiar with the current workings of RDA up to date with what's happening with the new official toolkit and the implementation of that. I'll talk a little bit at the end about other events that we're planning to organise over the next wee while. So UKCoR is responsible for contributing to the development and maintenance of resource description access, RDA, on behalf of the UK Library and Information professional community. And for the last few years, while developing RDA was constrained by the 3R project, we've not been actively contributing to development, but the committee still had a role in providing feedback to the RDA Steering Committee via URIG. So the 3R project focused on restructuring and redesigning the toolkit so that it was a properly online service, and the content was also edited at that time to bring it into alignment with the IFLA library reference model. It also did a lot to improve the internationalisation of the standard and continue to reduce the Anglo-American biases that were in there. And when that project was finalised, the beta toolkit became the official toolkit in December 2020. And even though the pandemic was underway at that point, we still thought implementation might happen in 2021, but for understandable reasons, it didn't. There, not only the pandemic contributing to delays, but there was actually a lot of work to do, especially in developing policy statements for the optional content in the new toolkit. So today we're going to hear about progress and get some insights into some of the issues being discussed with the new toolkit, and we'll have time, as Will's already mentioned, for Q&A at the end of the session. So first up, I will hand over to Alan Danskin from the British Library, who's going to let us know about the BL's implementation plans. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to keep my camera off in case we have any bandwidth issues. So I'll share some slides now. hopefully everyone can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Good.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so this is just an update on where we are now, and it includes some information about where we hope to be next year. So what I'm going to cover is a bit of context. I'll talk about our timeline, our documentation model and policy statements, some issues that we're involved in trying to resolve, and a little bit about what you can expect to get from us to support your own implementation in future. So the British Library's implementation of RDA official toolkit is intended to have a low impact, at least on our cataloguers, if not on our cataloguing managers. We're looking at minimal change from current practice, largely because we have an Aleph library management system which uses MARC 21. We had hoped by now that we wouldn't have that, but that's what we've got. So we are carrying on with MARC 21 for the moment. We won't be moving to BibFrame in the foreseeable future. So some of the benefits that we might expect to get from RDA won't really be realised. However, so this is our provisional timeline. At the moment, we're in the process of developing documentation in accordance with the model that I'm about to show you. That work is expected to carry on through to December, end of December, at which point we'll test what we've got, and there'll be a review period at the end of that to see whether we need to tweak things or adjust things, and then we will develop some specific materials for training, and that will take us through to the end of May probably, and then once that's completed we'll be able to start delivering training internally. Just for some context, there will be an URIG RDA Day on the 17th of November where you can hear all this again. There will be the Library of Congress's objective is to have all of its staff operational in BibFrame by the end of the year, this year. I'm not, whether that's going to be achieved, I don't know, but that's what their objective is. And you may have seen that the Programme for Cooperative Cataloguing has said that they don't expect to start implementation before June of next year, as they're assessing documentation, etc., from Library of Congress. This is happening. We've got this session today. I'm setting up some meetings with the legal deposit libraries, and we have a subgroup of the legal deposit libraries metadata committee, which is looking at implementation of the official toolkit, but we haven't met for some time because BL's been really focusing on trying to get our documentation underway, and that's now in progress. So I'm going to reconvene those meetings, and there will be an event which I dare say you'll hear more about later this in the year, run by MDG, so a hands-on event for RDA. And then we also have the next release of the toolkit, which is when policy statements get added or amended, will be in December, and then there will be further releases in March and July. So in terms of our documentation, we're already publishing our policy statements in the toolkit, and I'll say something about that in a moment. We've conducted an audit of internal policy and guidance documents to see whether things can stay as they are, whether they need to be revised. Several documents need revision in terms of terminology, etc., and reference to the existing toolkit need to be changed. So that work has in progress as part of the overall documentation project. And we've developed a model for how we're managing our documentation, and I'm going to show you a diagram of that shortly. We're also evaluating a number of different platforms to see what the best approach to publishing that documentation will be for internal and external purposes. That process is in progress at the moment, so I can't say what the outcome will be. Certainly the policy statements are obviously published in the toolkit, and we would anticipate to making as much as possible available through the toolkit or through our website, or potentially the Learning Hub, which is open to external users as well. So policy statements. This is, as Jenny mentioned, been a significant amount of work. So according to our count, there are nearly 4,500 policy options within RDA. So a current estimate is that we've got statements for over 3,000, almost 3,700 of those. So there's less than 1,000 left. Some of these are low priority for us because at the moment we're not too concerned about sound recordings, although I appreciate that other people may be. But we have we will be continuing to add policy statements at future releases, and so eventually we'll close that gap. So this is what you can expect to see in the official toolkit if you've not already familiar with it. Our policies appear in line with the relevant condition heading or option. Our policy statements are quite terse. They say catalogue is judgment. They say do not apply. They may say apply if applicable. That one probably shouldn't say that, but oh yeah, that's it. We say apply if applicable if there's a condition. We say apply if there's no condition. So, and generally speaking, we use catalogue as judgment for things like notes and things where we can't really tell people whether there are any criteria to apply in order to give a note or not. It's really a question of judgment. So we try to keep these quite short so that they can appear in full in the right rail. We do supplement them with additional documentation where appropriate, which I'll be talking about in a moment. But behind the scenes, we manage our policy statements through a master spreadsheet, which we use to enable batch loading of updates into the RDA toolkit. It's quite a complex process, which has a quite tight timetable, and for which we need to review the statements when they go into the toolkit, make sure they're in the right place and they actually say what we thought they said. But it's an efficient process as well, in the sense that it means that we actually have some possibility of getting all of the policy statements into the toolkit before implementation, which would never have been possible without this automated process. So this is our documentation model. So at the top, we've got a guidance document that provides sort of general guidance for implementation of RDA within the British Library. It provides an introduction to the documentation itself, and it provides generic guidance about things such as pre-recording, the various types of instructions about notes, etc., where we can say some general things that will be of use to catalogers and will save repetition in other documents. We're developing documents on each entity to pull together any guidance that's specific to those entities. and to provide links out to additional documentation. And we have we've got application profiles for a bibliographic record and for an authority record, which I'll say a bit more about shortly, but they act as a kind of way in to the documentation and a way of navigating through the process of creating a catalogue record. And we have some documents at the element level, and those are the ones that are primarily in progress at the moment. We're not producing a document for every element, but we're trying to produce documents where it's useful to do so. All of these documents, where possible, include MARC coding for our staff, and we recording the recording method and the description level within the application profiles. And all of the documents, wherever possible, are interlinked so that people can navigate between them. So, so here's a slide that shows on the right-hand side the contents page for our general guidance document. We're versioning all the documents when it was current. We're writing the application profiles will act as indexes to the documentation and to the toolkit. Supporting documents will support the guidance in the official toolkit. We're not repeating information from the toolkit. We're simply trying to supplement it, and particularly in relation to providing worked examples with context and information that is in our current workflows, where possible and appropriate, is being incorporated into our documents where that information isn't already in the toolkit. We've got a standard template for this. We're aiming for as much consistency across our workflows for different types of material, etc., as possible. So we're looking at a kind of spine with ribs that branch off where there's something that's different for a particular type of resource. But we're trying to, one of the big benefits that I see from from the official toolkit is the consistent approach that RDA takes to different types of material, and only including exceptions where it's important for representing that type of material. We have a principle of sufficiency, that we're not creating information where we don't need to. And as I said, we've got worked examples throughout. This is just for illustration an example of a special guidance document, which this one was written to cover different identifiers, and it kind of exemplifies what I was saying about trying to pull things together into a generic spine. So we've got information about all types of identifiers here, but we've got guidance that is specific to those identifiers within the documentation, mostly illustrated with examples. And the examples themselves have captions, explanatory captions. And where appropriate, we've included headings so that we can easily get to the bit that's relevant. So the application profiles themselves, it's work in progress, but they're a navigational aid. They act as an index to both RDA and the supporting documentation. We have links to the RDA instructions and to element level documents. We're also tying our quality levels into the elements that we would expect to have in a basic record, elements that we would expect to have in a effective record will be flagged in the application profile. And we're going to have two. We thought it was sensible to separate bibliographic records and authority records in the application profiles because we're using different MARC formats, obviously. But in terms of the documentation, bibliographic and elements for bibliographic and authority data are treated more or less the same. We don't duplicate elements for a purpose, but we may have different examples illustrating bibliographic records and authority records. Our application profiles are based on our existing Aleph templates for different types of resource, and the legal deposit library standard record template. Yeah, we're putting in the recording methods that are appropriate to different elements. We're putting in the MARC coding, and we're putting in vocabulary encoding schemes where necessary. And here's an example. This is just an extract. And as I said, it's work in progress, but down the left-hand side, you can see that we've got some generic elements, which are those things that came from our internal Aleph templates that were shared between different templates for different types of material. So we've also got things that are specific to serials or to music or to cartographic. And there are some things in here that, not on this particular slide, that have come explicitly from the Legal Deposit Library standard record. There's work underway, has been underway for some time on configuration issues in terms of our systems. Thurstan's going to talk about MARC 21 changes. We're looking at, in that context, validation within our systems for Aleph and Primo, indexing and what goes into displays. New elements have to be incorporated from the and included in the RDA to MARC mappings. And we're developing various macros as new shortcuts for catalogers within Aleph. We make extensive use of macros to speed up processing. A number of issues under discussion include community resources, pages, mode of issuance and extension plan, which we'd like to implement, relationship designators, and representative expression. I can briefly show these things. Relationship designators, we want to maintain continuity by using deverbalized alternative labels, which are in the toolkit. You can see them if you look in the element reference. And this is the one for, this is for author agent. What we would propose to do is to record the agent in the $E, so we'd say author in $E, and then we'd record the URI for the constrained attribute. That means the attribute that relates to work, in this case, in $4 in the MARC record. We know what kind of agent it is from the MARC record anyway, so we don't need to go down to a lower level of granularity. And as I said, we're going to use macros for more efficiency in applying this. And that work has been planned out. There's a work request drafted for it. We're just in discussion with Library of Congress and PCC about this approach. Library of Congress have seemed quite in favour of it. There's some discussions going on with PCC, however. The community resources pages, these were a sort of balance, as Jenny mentioned, between internationalisation and community needs. Most of the content derives from ACR2 and RDA and classed as refinements to instructions or as vocabularies. It deals particularly with string encoding schemes. The way in which you structure authorised access points differs between different communities, and the existing instructions largely cover Anglo-American community. So there are some discussions underway around how these are going to be maintained by the community and developed in future, and that we expect some documentation from ALA towards the end of this month, I believe. As I said, we're looking at mode of issuance and extension plan as attributes that we might want to introduce explicitly. They're kind of implicit in MARC, but and in the original toolkit. Mode of issuance is an attribute in the original toolkit, but it's split up in the new toolkit into two things: mode of issuance, how many, whether you've got one or more units, and the extension plan. We think these are really useful in terms of understanding diachronic works. Which is why we want to implement it, but there are implications for staff in acquisitions and in cataloguing that we need to work through, and discussions are ongoing around that. We don't plan to implement representative expression explicitly, but we do plan to continue to provide attributes within authorized access points that represent the expression that's being described. And we will make available our documentation and training in an appropriate platform when it's ready to support the rest of the community in implementing RDA. And we do aim to offer a training course later in 2023. We have obviously had RDA in a day, but we'll be replacing that with something else, and we haven't delivered that for some time now. There are other resources available, obviously, if you prefer. There's a lot of useful information that we actually worked with Library of Congress and PECC on metadata guidance documentation. And I certainly recommend that you look at those. There's also the RDA YouTube channel, and there's information on the RSC website and then the RDA Toolkit site. So that's my updates from the British Library. I hope if you've got any questions, we'll pick them up at the end, I expect.
Thanks a lot, Alan. That's great. With everybody muted, you didn't hear the sigh of relief as you said the British Library is going to share their documentation in due course. But
I haven't seen it yet.
As Alan says, there's lots of resources available online. I would
stop sharing. Sorry.
That's okay. I would second his recommendations for having a look at the RDA resources available online. We'll talk more about what else UKCoR is planning to do to support the community at the end of this. I think now I'll just hand over to Thurstan, who's going to give us a little bit on developments with MARC.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Thurstan. I'll mute now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, yep.
Right, thank you. Okay, so my name's Thurstan Young. I work for the British Library, and I'm going to give you an update on the activities of the MARC RDA working group and its achievements during its period of activity between 2019 and 2022. So this also summarises the work of the wider community in making changes to the MARC 21 formats reflecting the RDA official toolkit during that time. I'll be covering the MARC RDA working group's charge, its membership, focus, its list of accomplishments, wider community engagement, and some further learning points. So, in terms of the MARC RDA working group, some background to that. It was first set up at the end of 2019 to consider the issues around implementing changes which arose from the RDA Toolkit Restructure and Redesign 3R project. A similar group was formed in 2008 to look at MARC 21 changes required to implement RDA in its original form. And the MRWG's charge was set out as follows. To evaluate the scope and impact of the extensions to RDA arising from the 2019 revision in relation to MARC 21, to identify and prioritise possible changes to MARC 21 to support compatibility with the RDA extensions and ensure effective data exchange into the future, and to prepare discussion papers and proposals for the MARC Advisory Committee. So the MARC RDA working group's membership consisted of various key stakeholders across the community. These included the RSC Wider Community Engagement Officer, Charlene Chu latterly, but previously Eb Cartus, and also the Chief of the Network Development MARC Standards Office, NDMSO, at Library of Congress, Sally McCallum. We also had input from members of the MARC steering group, myself representing the British Library, also representation from Library of Congress, Deutsche Nationalbibliothek, and Library and Archives Canada. There was also some vendor input from Index Data and OCLC. And specialist input for audiovisual, cartographic, music, serials, and rare books manuscript cataloguing. So in terms of the group's focus, it's very much reference for making changes to MARC 21 aligned with the following 4 criteria. New RDA entities, concepts and vocabulary encoding schemes, the choice of format to implement change, the granularity and consistency of change, and feasibility and utility of that change. In terms of new RDA entities, we're talking about the RDA entity, the Gnomon agent, collective agent, place, and timespan entities, which all form part of the official RDA toolkit. In terms of new RDA concepts, we're looking at manifestation statements, representative expressions, diachronic works, and data provenance. And as regards new vocabulary encoding schemes, we're looking at things like RDA carrier extent unit, RDA extension plan, RDA mode of issuance, RDA recording sources, and RDA type of binding. There are also some vocabulary encoding schemes relating to the original RDA toolkit, which were carried over into the new RDA toolkit, and for which at that time no MARC encoding was available. Those covered things like aspect ratio designation, illustrative content, sound content, and form of musical notation. So in terms of the choices, we had to make decisions as regards which was the appropriate format to propose a change, if a change was going to be proposed. The authority format, the bibliographic format, another format, a combination of different formats. We had to look at the granularity and consistency of change proposed in MARC 21. Should we be doing that at the record level, at the field level? Likewise, the scope for consistency of coding. Should it be done equivalent field by field or equivalent format by format? Also, the feasibility and utility of change in MARC 21. Was it possible to do within format constraints? The MARC 21 standards are old and in many respects they are getting fuller and fuller as time goes on. So was the available coding available to make the changes that we considered necessary? Was it possible to make changes in a way that will be consistent with existing record models, such as NACO, BibCo, and provider neutral? Also, what was the helpfulness of change from the perspective of end users, for example, researchers and programmers, and from the perspective of collection management, covering functions such as inventory control and workflow efficiency? So in terms of our progress as a group, I'm going to go through the changes to MARC which have been affected over the past several years. So MARC Update 31, issued in December 2020, we had new MARC coding to cover manifestation statements in field 881 of the bibliographic format, extension plan in 335 of the bibliographic and authority formats. In MARC Updates 32 and 33, issued in June and December 2021, we had new coding for mode of issuance in field 334 of the bibliographic format and type of binding in field 340$L of the bibliographic format. Most recently, in MARC Update 34, issued in June 2022, we had new coding at the field level to cover data provenance, subfield 7 and other subfields by exception in the bibliographic and authority formats, covering over 180 different fields within those formats. And new code lists for data provenance, the categories of it and subfield relationships provided in the authority and bibliographic formats. Also, as part of that update, we had new coding in field 387 and others by exception in the bibliographic and authority formats to cover representative characteristics, and a change to the scope of field 507 in the bibliographic format to align with RDA's definition of scale. A little bit now on wider community engagement. So, as regards MARC Update 31, there was new coding to cover the recording of aspect ratio designation in field 345 subfield $D and illustrative content in 340 subfield $P, enabling you to record controlled terms from the RDA Toolkit vocabulary encoding schemes. MARC Update 32, we had new coding in 344$I to record sound content and 348$C to cover form of musical notation. Again, a means of recording controlled terms from RDA vocabulary encoding schemes. And most recently, in Update 34, new coding to record reduction ratio designation in 340$Q and agent relationships in field 373$I and $4 of the authority format. So, outstanding issues. So there are some issues which the MRWG did not address during its period of activity, and which the wider community has not addressed up to this point. Most notably, these include the new entities which form part of the RDA Toolkit following the 3R project. However, as can be seen from this slide, many of these entities are still the subject of ongoing work by the RSC, and therefore follow-on adaptations to MARC 21 may be considered premature at this time. The entities RDA entity and agent were considered too high level to provide new coding for by the MARC RDA working group. And some learning points. So there were various points that came out of the work conducted by the MRWG and its liaisons with RSC and NDMSO at Library of Congress. Firstly, new coding was not mandatory to the implementation of RDA. That RSC liaison was available to provide advice and assistance where necessary. And that feedback from the MARC Advisory Committee may contribute to future RDA developments. RDA would not adapt to MARC 21 record structures if these broke its relationships to the LRM, Library Reference Model, and the MARC RDA Working Group was not an open-ended commitment, but further RDA-related changes may be proposed by MARC 21 constituencies in future. And lastly, I'd like to point you to the Library of Congress's MARC RDA Working Group page for details of the papers, the discussion papers and proposals which went into making changes to the MARC standards over the last few years, and details of those. And I will copy out that link and place it into the discussion chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thurstan. You've condensed a huge amount of work into a very short presentation there. Thank you. We're with slight delays at the beginning. We're rapidly running out of time, and I want to try and keep a bit of space for Q&A. So I'll move on quickly to let Gordon tell us a bit about collections and how they're being handled in RDA. Over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Jenny. I hope everybody can see the screen.
Yes, we can.
Do not panic, it's only 4 slides long and I am going to speed up. There are notes associated with this presentation, and those together with the presentation will be published on my website this afternoon. So I hope you forgive me if I talk fast so that we have time for questions at the end. So I'm talking about the new model for collection level description that was added to RDA last year. The background to this is a model that was originally created by Michael Heaney from Oxford for some of the older members may remember UKCoR, the UK Office for Library Networking, and the RSLP, or Research Support Libraries Programme, of about 20 years ago. When that model was developed, Ferber had just been published, but it was years before the remaining IFLA functional requirements models were published or indeed consolidated into the IFLA library reference model. So there were certain aspects where there was not going to be a fit. The 3R project itself realized that there were quite a few loose ends to tie up in various pieces of the original RDA toolkit, which were to do with collection description. The first point is that the library reference model itself only briefly mentions collections. It doesn't go into any depth. There are legacy elements in the toolkit from the original, which again don't have the benefit of any model to be based on. There's also stuff in the toolkit for item provenance, which is of interest to rare books communities, about the audit trail of a particular item through various collections. And then there were some loose ends left over with a technical description of descriptions, that is metadata description sets, and the relationship between older concepts such as records and catalogues with newer concepts such as description sets. So the basic model for collections is that items are gathered together to form a collection manifestation. This is the old idea of a holding. So an item is held in a collection. Clearly, items from the same manifestation can end up in different collections. This has to be an item level focus. Because we have a collection manifestation, we have the rest of the collection WEMI stack. It has an interesting property in the cardinality between each of the components is 1-to-1. There can only be one collection expression, one collection work, and one collection item. And for various reasons, there is no need to describe either the collection expression or the collection item. Yeah, didn't mean to do that. The manifestation then is where all of these items are co-located, and that's part of the definition of a collection, and that ties up with the entity place. Collections can be sub-collections of other collections, and therefore the collection work has a part relationship to itself, which is inherited through collection expression down to collection manifestation. We have an existing set of legacy elements which tie individual items with specific owners. As I mentioned, this is of use to rare books librarianship, and that has been the traditional view. But we can now introduce a new relationship, which is collector-agent, which says that a single agent is responsible for the planning and execution of the collection work, which includes its accrual policy, its accrual method, and various other aspects of collecting. A very brief view of the basic model for collections. There's also a model for collection descriptions, or catalogues, as we tend to call them in the library world. The more generic term is finding aids, which is taken from archival communities. But there are various modes of identifying what a collection contains. So here's the basic model of a collection. The item is held by a collection manifestation, which embodies a collection work. The item may be described individually using a structured metadata description or metadata work, as RDA calls it. So this is a description of a single item. Of course, most of that description is inherited from the item's manifestation. The manifestation contains all of the common characteristics of the items in a manifestation. That forms a metadata work, as I said, and that metadata work has its own WEMI stack and therefore has a metadata expression. The metadata expression, which is a metadata statement in a particular kind of syntax, may be expressed as a relational database statement. It could be a linked data statement. It could be a MARC 21 statement. These are different expressions of essentially the same work, and the expression is aggregated into the catalogue, the expression of the catalogue. When you have more than one expression embodied in a single manifestation, in this instance the finding aid or the catalogue, you have an aggregate by definition. And so this is a new concept that catalogues are in fact aggregates of metadata statements. Catalogues have their own WEMI stack. I've obviously omitted most of the stack for clarity. And we can finally close the loop, because we can say that the catalogue work, which is a gigantic set of metadata statements about multiple items, as a whole constitutes a metadata description of the collection work. So this establishes the fundamental relationship between a catalogue and the collection which it is describing. One final sophistication is that it's possible to create a single description of the collection as a whole. You may have in your own library descriptions or records which detail a collection. That can be as small as a pamphlet box containing 50 photographs. That still constitutes a collection. You're not describing the individual items in that pamphlet box, you're describing the collection as a whole. Again, this is a work description, a metadata work description which has its own expression. And finally, we can aggregate that expression into the catalogue, and we end up with a hybrid catalogue of item level descriptions and collection level descriptions, which is very similar to an archival finding aid. So this model actually serves the archives, museum and library communities, and this is very much due to the basis that Heaney established with his model. There are some links here, you'll find them in the presentation later, I won't dwell on them, to the original model, to the proposal from RDA, and to a brief non-technical description that I wrote for IFLA recently. That's it.
Thank you, Gordon. The modelling side of things is big and complex, so having a snapshot of it through looking at collections is a useful way of giving us some insight. Thank you. Anybody who would like to kick off the Q&A is very welcome to raise their hand, and we'll get things moving. Of course, you're welcome to put things into the Q&A chat if you would rather that I read them out to our panel. While everybody's typing and or deciding if they're going to be brave enough to raise their hand, I will talk a little bit about UKCoR. So we're generally been meeting online every couple of months over the last wee while, but we're starting to do in-person events again. Some of you may remember that there were years ago events called Ferber for the Terrified, and with the new library reference model and its implementation in RDA, we want to sort of help novices and those feeling less confident in this sphere by having what we're calling uncataloguing workshops, which are kicking off on the 9th of December with the help of MDG in Scotland. So the first event will be in Edinburgh then, and there's every expectation that we'll get something in early 2023, most likely in Birmingham will initially. But anybody else who's willing to help organise is free to get in touch and demand that we do it closer to them. Another way that we'd like you to get in touch is to join UKCoR. We have openings for more committee members. So if you're interested in descriptive cataloguing, want to influence proposals, development of RDA, want the inside line on what's happening with RDA, this is your chance to get involved. There are experts on the committee, but not all of us are experts on the committee. Everybody's viewpoint is useful, so don't feel that you have to know RDA inside out before you're welcome on UKCoR. Right, I need a question and nobody is being brave enough.
Well, if it's okay for me just to fill in a bit of the silence for now as well. First of all, thanks for that. That's really informative from all the perspectives that you've presented today. Thanks very much. But since you mentioned that there are openings on UKCoR, I also felt like I could announce that there are also openings on the MDG committee as well. We have a few opportunities for volunteers to get involved. The most pressing one that we have at the moment is for the role of marketing officer or communications officer, whatever you like to call it. And it's not, I think the word marketing can be a bit scary to us catalogers, as Will and I were discussing the other day, but what we mean by that is basically I see it as more of an advocacy role for those of us who are passionate about advocating about the metadata discovery, cataloging, all of the things that we are concerned with in our committee. So that's mostly to do with coordinating all of our efforts on our website, on social media, on the newsletter, on whatever other outreach events we have. We're hoping to have, if things continue to go well, an in-person conference in 2023. So there would be a role in there as well for maybe designing logos, programs, those kinds of things. So it's really a lot of kind of background work you can do at your desk in that sense. And we have 2 communications officers who would be part of a marketing team. So basically you'd be working with the 2 of them to coordinate all of the communications efforts and sort of what I consider advocacy for MDG, but not in a scary way, I promise. So if you are interested in any of that, to volunteer for the community, please get in touch with me and I'll be happy to share with you our thoughts for that. And Will and I are also happy to have a call with whoever might be interested to discuss what we see the role looking like and seeing if we can come up with something that is of interest to anyone. You don't need web development experience, you don't need marketing experience or any of that sort of thing, but just an interest and a passion for advocacy is really, I think, the main things that we need from you at this point.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in. I think this highlights the difficulties cataloguers have with sticking their head above the parapet and doing the advocacy thing, perhaps. I will round off then by thanking our three presenters very much for their contributions. Emphasise again that it would be good to get more people involved with UKCoR and look out for announcements of events coming up. You're very welcome to get in touch with any of us following this webinar if you have questions. I think 2023, with implementation of the official toolkit starting to happen in various communities, will make it all more concrete, and specific questions are going to start to come up as people get to grips with their implementations. So I am hopeful that UKCoR can support UK catalogers to do that. Alan also mentioned that URIG has an event coming up next month, so that's another avenue for people wanting to hear more about various developments. Thanks again, Will. I'll hand back to you.
Yep, thank you, Jenny. Just the last question is about presentation slides. I think Gordon's going to drop his on his website, which is, I can't remember the name. Is it GordonDunsire.com or something?
Yeah, it's www.gordondunsire.com.
Yeah, so, and I'm sure Alan and Thurstan can share the slides with me and I can distribute them afterwards. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks everyone. I will now stop the recording and